Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I want you to imagine a man sitting on a dusty hillside. He has, no army. He holds no political office.
Right, none at all.
Yeah, I mean, he possesses zero earthly wealth. In fact, he is precisely 3 days away from being arrested, stripped, and tortured to death by the most lethal empire on the face of the earth.
And yet, he looks at his closest friends and casually announces, in a little while, I'm going to sit on a blazing throne and judge every single human being who has ever lived.
Yeah, it's a massive claim. The goal of this deep dive today is to unpack that staggering statement found in Matthew 25, verses 31 through 33.
It really is staggering. We are looking at a text that takes our modern, comfortable assumptions about the future and just completely shatters them.
For sure. We have a huge stack of theological analysis in front of us, and we are going to use it to understand how the culmination of human history actually works.
That is the right way to frame this. We are not looking at some obscure appendix to the biblical text. We are looking at the absolute climax.
The finale.
Yeah, the finale. The material we are analyzing today approaches this text with total gravity. This passage is not an academic puzzle. It is a cosmic summons that demands a verdict from you, the listener, today.
I want to start by stepping into the historical reality of that moment on the Mount of Olives. The shadow of the cross is looming,
Absolutely. The tension would have been palpable.
Jesus is sitting with his disciples, and they ask him about the end of the age. Think about the striking contrast here. Jesus is literally days away from being crushed by the Roman political machine.
And Rome was the ultimate authority in their world.
Right. How would the disciples even begin to reconcile the impending, humiliating cross with this royal, cosmic announcement?
To understand the psychology of the disciples in that moment, we have to look at the political and religious scene of the first century. Politically, Judea was under absolute Roman dominion.
Caesar's authority was visible everywhere.
Yes, it was armed. It was irresistible to the natural eye. Herod's dynasty and the local religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, operated entirely underneath that imperial thumb.
So they weren't really in charge.
Not at all. So Jesus making this claim was not some private religious comfort. It was a royal announcement that relativized every earthly court. Rome could crucify him, but they could not dethrone him.
He is basically looking at the empire that is about to kill him and saying, I am the one who will judge you.
Precisely. And religiously, the disciples were steeped in Old Testament prophecy, specifically Daniel chapter 7.
Oh, that's a huge connection.
It is. In Daniel's vision, one like a son of man comes with the clouds of heaven and receives dominion, glory, and an everlasting kingdom from the Ancient of Days.
And Jesus adopts that specific title for himself right here.
Yeah, he is the exalted Son of Man. Now, to grasp the specific timeline our material lays out, we have to look at the dispensational framework provided by the sources.
Right, because they are very specific about the sequence of events.
They are. The argument here is that this event in Matthew 25 is specifically the judgment of the living nations.
Okay, let's slow down and break that down for the listener who might be, driving to work right now and has no idea what that means.
Sure, that makes sense.
There are several judgments mentioned in Scripture. We need to explain the mechanism of this specific timeline according to our sources.
Let's unpack it. According to the framework in the text, this judgment occurs after the 70th week of Daniel.
That is a theological term for what is commonly known as the tribulation.
Spot on. It's a literal 7-year period of unprecedented global upheaval and divine wrath poured out on the earth.
So this judgment happens right after that.
Yes, this judgment takes place on earth right after that period, specifically prior to the establishment of a literal 1,000-year millennial kingdom. The material is highly specific about drawing distinctions here.
Because it's not the Great White Throne judgment we see in Revelation 20.
Right. The Great White Throne happens after the millennium. That is the final judgment of the unsaved dead.
Yeah.
The Great White Throne involves the resurrection and condemnation of those who died in rebellion. Matthew 25 is distinct from that. Furthermore, it is not the Bema Seat judgment of the church.
Let's clarify the Bema Seat for the listener.
The Bema Seat is where believers are rewarded for their works. In this specific pre-tribulational framework our sources use, the church has already been raptured prior to the 7 years.
So they are already with Christ.
Right. And they are now returning to earth with him. So the subjects of this Matthew 25 judgment are the living individuals, the survivors of the tribulation period.
It is fascinating how the authors tackle other theological views of this timeline. They take direct aim at frameworks like amillennialism and postmillennialism.
They really do. They argue that those views flatten this prophetic timeline.
What is their specific exegetical contention with those alternative views? Just to be fair and report what they are saying.
The contention is that amillennial and postmillennial frameworks spiritualize the text and blur the chronological lines of prophecy.
Amillennialism generally teaches that there is no literal future thousand-year reign on Earth, right?
Yes, it teaches that we are in the millennium now, in a spiritual sense. Postmillennialism teaches that the world will gradually Christianize through the spread of the gospel, leading to a golden age, after which Christ returns.
But our sources disagree with that approach.
Very much so. The material we are analyzing asserts that failing to recognize a literal tribulation followed by a literal millennium obscures the critical distinction between national Israel and the New Testament church.
That distinction is a massive part of their argument.
It is. The argument is that God has unfulfilled covenantal promises given to national Israel in the Old Testament. Those promises must be dealt with distinctly at the end of the age.
So the judgment of the nations in Matthew 25 is the gateway to fulfilling those promises.
Exactly. Well, yes, it determines who physically enters that earthly kingdom.
Okay, so he is painting this terrifying, literal picture of a future judgment. But just 2 sentences prior in Matthew 25, he was talking about bridesmaids with oil lamps waiting for a bridegroom.
And guys burying bags of money in a field.
Right. So if I am reading this for the first time, I have to ask, how on earth do we know he is not just telling another metaphorical story? Does the genre suddenly shift here?
The genre shifts decisively. This is not another parable.
Okay, so they take it entirely literally.
Yes, the material is adamant that while it uses a pastoral simile, comparing the separation of people to a shepherd separating animals, the passage itself is a literal, explicit, apocalyptic prophecy.
It is a straightforward description of a future historical event.
Spot on. It is the applicatory conclusion to everything Christ has just spoken on the Mount of Olives.
The transition is from parabolic warnings about readiness to the literal reality of what happens when the waiting is over.
Yes, you move from the illustration of the event directly to the event itself.
It is really interesting how the authors tackle modern politics here. Our sources actually take direct aim at movements like the social justice movement or liberation theology.
They do, in critical race theory and even open border policies.
Right. And again, for the listener, we aren't taking a side here. We are just impartially reporting what the authors of this theological material are arguing.
Of course, it's just what is in the text.
If you scroll through social media or listen to political speeches, you often hear verse 40 quoted, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me."
It gets used a lot in those contexts.
It does. The authors argue that these movements are essentially hijacking the text for political gain. What is their exegetical basis for saying that?
The authors argue that these modern movements strip the text of its eschatological reality. They claim these groups take the phrase, "the least of these," and twist it into a mandate for generic government welfare.
Or political philanthropy.
Right. The exegetical basis for their critique is that this interpretation completely ignores the literary and historical sequence of the Olivet Discourse.
Break that sequence down for us. What did they miss?
The preceding chapter, Matthew 24, focuses heavily on the intense persecution of the tribulation period. It speaks of a time when believers will be hated by all nations.
So it's a very specific context of suffering.
Yes. According to the argument in our material, the least of these, my brothers, does not refer to the general poor of society across all of history.
Who does it refer to then?
Rather, it refers specifically to the persecuted Jewish remnant, the 144,000 and those associated with them.
The ones who will endure horrific suffering and starvation under the Antichrist during the tribulation.
Precisely. The nations are judged based on how they treated Christ's specific, persecuted representatives during that specific future time frame.
It is not a generalized command for modern state policy.
That is the core of their argument. Ripping a text out of its literary sequence leads to massive misinterpretations of the author's original goal.
I can see how that happens.
When you ignore the prophetic setup of Matthew 24 and the focus on the tribulation, you end up applying a final judgment prophecy as a blueprint for contemporary civic administration.
And the material views that as a fatal distortion of the biblical text. You cannot take a prophecy about the culmination of the age and turn it into a political platform for today.
Right. That's their stance.
With that dispensational and literary framework set, our deep dive moves to the very first action of the text. Verse 31, the arrival of the king.
The text says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne."
The material highlights the Greek syntax here. It points out the combination of the word hotan whenever or when combined with elthi, he comes.
It operates like a royal decree.
Yeah, it is absolutely certain that the king is coming, but the exact date is contingent on his timing. It is a guarantee shrouded in temporal mystery.
That's a great way to put it.
I have a question about the title he uses, though. Why does Jesus use the title Son of Man here instead of Son of God?
That takes us right back to Daniel 7. The title Son of Man bridges two massive realities: true humanity and heavenly authority.
Because he has to be both.
Yes. By using this title, Jesus is affirming that he truly shares our nature. The judge of the earth is a man who knows what it is to bleed, to weep, and to suffer.
But he is not just any man.
No, he is the heavenly figure to whom the Ancient of Days gives universal dominion. It is a staggering claim to deity that still retains his incarnational reality.
The Father has ordained that judgment be executed through the incarnate Son.
Right, and the text says he comes in his glory. The material spends a lot of time analyzing the Greek word doxa.
It points out that he does not come in glory as some general atmospheric state, but in his glory.
Yes, the distinction is massive. This is not borrowed splendor. He does not acquire this glory from the angels or from the saints.
This is the uncreated Shekinah glory of Yahweh.
Spot on. During his first advent, that divine majesty was veiled beneath the form of a servant. When he walked the dusty roads of Galilee, he looked like a normal, marginalized carpenter.
Even his miracles only revealed his glory to those who had eyes of faith.
True. But at the second advent, the veil is entirely removed. He returns in blinding, terrifying radiance. The contrast between the first advent and the second advent is an absolute reversal of human expectation.
And he doesn't come alone. He has all the angels with him.
The text clarifies that the angels are not equals here. They are attendants.
It is a display of total cosmic supremacy. The despised Nazarene is returning with the armed forces of heaven.
The one who was judged unjustly by corrupt human courts in the dead of night will now judge all humanity with perfect, unclouded justice in broad daylight.
The text says, then he will sit on his glorious throne. The verb used there is kathesai, he will sit.
That denotes a settled, absolute judicial authority. Judges sit to render verdicts, kings sit to reign.
The throne is not contested, it is not up for a democratic vote, it is not provisional.
The analysis highlights that this is a literal Davidic throne established in Jerusalem. This refutes any attempt to domesticate Jesus into a mere moral philosopher or a symbol of social harmony.
He is the sovereign adjudicator of the universe, taking his rightful seat.
Yes, and once the king is seated, the court has to be called to order.
That brings us to verse 32, the first part of the verse, the universal assembly. Before him will be gathered all the nations.
The material points out the passive voice in the Greek verb here. Humanity is gathered.
They don't gather themselves, they don't form a line voluntarily, it is divine compulsion.
Let's think about this like a legal proceeding. This isn't a town hall meeting where attendance is optional, or you can send a proxy to represent your interests.
It is a cosmic subpoena.
That is a highly accurate analogy. The phrasing, all the nations, pantata ethne, is highly significant.
In Jewish literature, this specific term was strictly used to describe Gentiles, distinguishing them from the covenant people of Israel.
Right. Tying this back to the dispensational timeline we discussed earlier, these are the unresurrected Gentiles who have survived the horrific events of the tribulation.
They are gathered to have their entrance into the millennial kingdom determined.
The angels execute the subpoena, and no one can resist the summons.
There is a brilliant analysis of the human condition in this section regarding this forced assembly.
There really is.
We live in an era of gated communities, encrypted messaging, and private browsing. We want to curate our reality.
Humans want a world without a summons.
We want privacy from God. We want to be the authors of our own moral universe.
The modern heart says, my identity is self-defined and I am accountable to no one. The text shatters that illusion entirely.
The passive voice of that gathering means no one possesses privacy from the Creator.
Think about the psychological terror of that moment for someone who has spent their life avoiding God. The public atheist, the respectable moralist, the secret hypocrite, and the forgotten poor.
They all have no escape from this universal gathering. Kings and peasants are dragged before the same bench.
The illusion of human autonomy is ripped away the moment the angels compel the assembly. You cannot hide behind your wealth, your political connections, or your carefully crafted public image.
The entire world is gathered. They are standing before the blazing glory of the Son of Man. That leads to the central, most terrifying action of the passage.
Verse 32, the second part, and verse 33, the absolute separation.
He will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left.
Jesus uses this agrarian analogy that would have made total sense to his listeners.
In the ancient Near East, sheep and goats grazed together during the day. They mingled in the same fields.
But at night, the shepherd easily divided them.
I want to bring up a metaphor to explain how this works. It's like an apple tree. Stapling apples to a dead branch doesn't make it an apple tree.
No, it doesn't.
The tree produces apples because it is already alive at the root. Does the shepherd separate these people based on what they did, like stapling apples to a branch, or based on what they inherently are at the root?
That is the crucial question. And the material dives deep into the ontology of this separation. Ontology meaning the study of being or the inherent nature of a thing.
So the separation is based on their inherent nature.
Yes. A goat does not become a sheep by acting like a sheep. You do not become a sheep by doing sheep-like things.
The division is based on their fundamental nature, which, according to the theological framework we are examining, is established by sovereign regeneration.
God changes the nature of the person.
They are separated because of who they fundamentally are, not because they earned a certain status through actions.
The shepherd does not need the animals to wear name tags. He knows what they are by looking at them. Jesus separates them infallibly.
He places the sheep on the right hand. In ancient culture, the right hand signifies the position of covenantal blessing, ultimate favor, and honor.
And the left hand signifies disfavor, cursing, and rejection.
The separation is absolute. There is no middle ground. You are either on the right or on the left.
Right.
Wait, I have to push back here. We just spent all this time establishing that the Reformed view is faith alone. We just talked about the tree and the root.
We did.
But the very next verse has the king separating people based on whether they fed the hungry, clothed the naked, and visited the prisoners.
It does say that.
That sounds exactly like earning your way in through charity. How do these sources resolve that glaring contradiction? If I am listening to this, it sounds like works-based salvation.
It is a vital question. The harmony is found in understanding the relationship between the root and the fruit.
Okay, lay that out for us.
The Reformed view insists that justification is by faith alone. You cannot earn your way onto the right hand of the judge by racking up charitable deeds.
However, the faith that justifies is never alone.
Spot on. It always produces fruit. The works of the sheep, which Jesus lists later in the chapter, are the evidence of their new regenerated nature.
They are not the meritorious ground of their salvation.
No, they are not.
So the works prove that the faith is real.
Yes. The sheep act out of love for Christ's brethren because they have been given a new heart by Christ. Their works vindicate the reality of the grace they have received.
The material we are analyzing aggressively contrasts this view with Arminianism and Roman Catholicism.
It does. The argument states that inserting any human merit into justification is a fatal theological error.
Systems that suggest humans can cooperate with God's grace to earn salvation are viewed as fundamentally opposed to the biblical gospel.
The authors point out that in the text, the sheep are actually surprised by their own righteous deeds. They ask, "Lord, when did we see you hungry?"
This proves the sheep weren't calculating their works to earn a reward.
Yes, the works flowed naturally and unconsciously from their regenerated state.
Let's step back and look at the sheer terror of this scene. The king is blazing with uncreated glory.
The assembly is inescapable.
The separation is absolute and infallible. If the judge is this absolute and human righteousness is, as the prophet Isaiah says, just filthy rags, what is the refuge?
How can anyone possibly stand on the right hand of this holy judge without being consumed? This raises an essential question that leads us into the Christological fulfillment of the passage. The material breaks down the threefold office of Christ: prophet, priest, and king.
He is the prophet, infallibly declaring the end of the age and the final judgment.
He is the king, possessing the universal dominion to execute the judgment and separate the nations.
But crucially, for anyone to survive this scene, he must be the great high priest.
That is actually a staggering paradox when you think about it.
The man sitting on the throne, demanding absolute perfection, is the exact same man who allowed himself to be slaughtered to provide it.
The only refuge from the wrath of the judge is the grace of the judge.
That completely flips the script on how we usually view a courtroom.
It is the core of Christian soteriology. soteriology being the doctrine of salvation.
Remember the historical context we discussed earlier. The cross was only days away when Jesus spoke these words on the Mount of Olives.
That impending cross was the substitutionary atonement required to place the sheep on the right hand.
The sheep survive the judgment because the judge is the lamb who was slain for them.
He endured the wrath of God on the cross so that his sheep would not endure it at the final judgment.
He takes the penalty they deserve, but it goes further than just clearing the debt, right?
Yes, it is a double transaction. It is not just the removal of guilt, it is the imputation of his perfect righteousness.
Imputation means legally crediting something to someone else's account.
The sheep are placed on the right hand not because they possess inherent flawless righteousness of their own, but because the flawless righteousness of the king has been legally credited to their account.
Prophet, priest, and king meet perfectly in the Son of Man.
Without his priestly sacrifice, the royal throne would mean certain doom for everyone.
Understanding that massive theological framework reveals what Matthew wanted his first readers to feel. Let's look at the authorial intent and the original audience.
Imagine being a first-century Jewish Christian.
You are marginalized. You are ostracized by your family. The synagogue has kicked you out.
The Roman Empire views you with suspicion and hostility. You are a hunted minority.
Why did Matthew think that recording a terrifying judgment scene would be effective pastoral care for a suffering community?
It seems counterintuitive to comfort suffering people with a vision of a terrifying judgment.
It does.
But the material details how this text had dual intended effects on the original audience: unshakable comfort and holy fear.
First, consider the comfort. When you are oppressed by unjust human courts, nothing brings more comfort than the promise of a perfect, absolute, infallible judge.
The text assures these suffering believers that their tears are seen. Their oppressors will not have the final word.
Ultimate vindication belongs to Christ.
It completely removes the need for personal revenge.
If you know that the ultimate judge is coming to settle all accounts perfectly, you don't have to take matters into your own hands.
That is the psychological relief it provides. Revenge is unnecessary because absolute perfect justice is guaranteed.
They could endure persecution with patience, knowing the sovereign Lord would right every wrong.
But the second intended effect was a severe prophetic warning meant to produce holy fear. It forces the visible church to examine itself.
Because there are sheep and goats mixed together in the visible church, proximity to the flock is not the same as belonging to the shepherd.
Right. The early church had hypocrites within its ranks, just as the church does today. The text strips away false assurances.
You cannot rely on ethnic heritage, superficial church association, or outward religious vocabulary.
The shepherd separates based on true, regenerated nature. The warning was designed to wake up the careless and drive them to genuine faith.
It forces the reader to ask, do I possess the root, or am I just stapling apples to a dead branch?
That dual effect of comfort and warning was not just for the first century.
The argument demands that this text be applied directly to the modern church today. Let's look at the contemporary application.
The text poses a direct challenge to the unbeliever, the true sheep, the modern pulpit, and the mission of the church.
Looking at the current cultural landscape of Christianity, one of the authors makes a heavy claim.
They state that modern evangelicalism often trades majestic divine realities for seeker-sensitive trivialities and psychological therapy.
How does this specific passage act as an antidote to that?
Let's run through the specific applications provided, starting with the unregenerate or the hypocrite within the church.
If you are listening to this and you think, well, I do a lot of good things, I'm generally a good person, I go to church, the authors are directly targeting that exact mindset.
They're trying to pull out the rug from under your assumptions.
For the hypocrite, relying on outward rituals, infant baptism, orthodox vocabulary, singing hymns, or conservative political affiliations is entirely useless.
The passage shatters the illusion of safety through proximity. Regeneration is absolutely required.
If the heart has not been changed, the outward religion will not save you from the left hand of the judge.
What about the application to the true sheep?
For the genuine believer, the text offers transcendent comfort. The world may mock biblical convictions, label them as backward or intolerant, and inflict suffering.
But the shepherd knows his own by name. Their position is secured by his grace.
However, the material is quick to add that this assurance should never produce antinomian laziness.
Antinomian meaning anti-law, the idea that because we are saved by grace, we can live however we want.
Correct. The reality of the approaching throne should produce a burning, fierce zeal for holiness.
Living in light of this judgment means rejecting secret sin and ordering priorities by eternity.
The tradition we are looking at directs heavy fire toward the modern pulpit as well.
It does. The argument is that preachers must declare a weighty Christ. They must reject the pragmatism that seeks to measure success by attendance numbers or market appeal.
The pulpit cannot be a place for religious entertainment or therapeutic vagueness.
It must proclaim the glory, the return, the throne, and the judgment of Christ. People walking toward a final judgment do not need a comedy routine.
They need the life-saving word of the coming king. The text demands absolute seriousness from anyone who claims to speak on behalf of God.
What does this mean for the mission of the church? How does this cosmic judgment impact evangelism?
The connection to missions is vital. Because the text explicitly states that all nations will be gathered, the church must have a fierce, unwavering urgency to evangelize all nations.
The material tackles a common misunderstanding here. It argues that the Reformed doctrine of sovereign election does not weaken evangelism, it actually fuels it.
Because Christ already has sheep among the nations who simply need to hear the call of the shepherd.
Yes, evangelism is the ordained means by which the shepherd calls his sheep. Every evangelistic conversation takes place under the shadow of this future throne.
The nations are not just sociological categories. They are individual people who must stand before the Son of Man.
Therefore, the church must go to them with the gospel while there's still time.
Election guarantees the success of the mission, which should give the church immense boldness.
It brings the massive cosmic scope of history right down to our immediate reality.
Let's summarize the sweeping trajectory of what we've covered today. The central claim of this text, and of the rigorous theological traditions that uphold it, is that history is not an endless circle of recurring troubles.
It is not chaos governed by tyrants, economic markets, or political fashions.
History is a straight line, and it is moving directly toward a glorious throne occupied by the Son of Man.
The timeline is fixed. The king is coming.
The assembly of every human being is compulsory, and the separation between the sheep and the goats is infallible.
That is the sober reality the text presents. There is no middle ground. You will stand on the right or you will stand on the left.
I want to leave you with a final concept to mull over based on the text we've examined today.
If every calendar date, every hidden sin, and every act of mercy exists under the shadow of this approaching throne,
how does that reality reshape the way you look at the smallest, most mundane choices you will make tomorrow?
when you wake up, when you interact with your family, when you go to work, how does knowing that the Son of Man is coming in his glory alter the way you live your Tuesday?
A question we all must face. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We will see you next time. Goodbye.